When you think of captured pirates, you probably picture bearded men swinging from gallows while crowds cheered their demise. But there was another category of prisoner whose fate was far more horrifying than any quick drop from a rope. The story you're about to hear isn't just about piracy, it's about how gender transformed punishment into something so twisted that maritime authorities systematically erased these accounts from official records. The year was 1712, and Port Royal's harbours echoed with the creaking of merchant vessels and the shouts of dock workers unloading precious cargo from the Caribbean. But on this sweltering August morning, a different sound would soon fill the air. The roar of a bloodthirsty crowd gathering to witness what would become one of history's most deliberately obscured spectacles. The women they came to see weren't the romanticized pirate queens of popular imagination, but flesh and blood criminals whose gender would transform their punishment from simple execution into elaborate psychological and physical torture designed to break not just their bodies, but their very identities as women. What transpired in those forgotten dungeons beneath colonial fortresses was not merely justice, but a calculated campaign of dehumanization that targeted the most fundamental aspects of feminine identity. Maritime law had no framework for dealing with women who violated the sacred boundaries of gender and criminality. These weren't ordinary criminals, but women who had dared to claim the same freedoms as men, to kill and plunder with the same ruthless efficiency as their male counterparts. Their very existence challenged everything colonial society believed about feminine nature, and their punishment would reflect society's desperate need to restore the natural order they had violated. The golden age of piracy had produced some of the most feared women in maritime history. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, whose exploits alongside Calico Jack Rackham had terrorized the Caribbean, represented just the tip of an iceberg that colonial authorities worked frantically to hide beneath the waves of historical amnesia. Contemporary records suggest dozens of women sailed under the black flag, their identities often concealed behind masculine disguises that allowed them to participate fully in the violent brotherhood of piracy. These women had learned to fight, kill, and command with a ferocity that shocked even hardened male pirates. They had transcended the boundaries of their gender so completely that capture meant facing punishment designed not just for their crimes, but for their transgression against the natural order itself. The transformation of these women from free pirates to captured prisoners began long before their trials. Unlike male pirates, who were typically imprisoned in standard cells while awaiting execution, captured pirate women faced immediate and systematic assault on their feminine identity. Prison guards, operating under direct orders from colonial governors, initiated what can only be described as a campaign of gender-based torture. The first step was always the forced removal of masculine clothing and the substitution of deliberately degrading feminine garments designed to emphasize their vulnerability and shame. Women who had commanded crews and inspired terror on the high seas found themselves dressed like common prostitutes, their hair forcibly styled in elaborate feminine arrangements that made them feel like grotesque parodies of womanhood. The psychological dimensions of this treatment were carefully calculated. Colonial authorities understood that these women had found power in rejecting traditional feminine roles, and their captors systematically destroyed every aspect of the identity that had given them strength. Pirate women who had bound their breasts to pass as men were forced to display their feminine attributes prominently. Those who had cultivated masculine mannerisms and speech patterns were punished severely for any deviation from exaggerated feminine behavior. The goal was not simply imprisonment, but the complete reconstruction of their identity according to colonial ideals of proper womanhood. Medical examinations represented another layer of humiliation specifically designed for female prisoners. Under the guise of determining their physical condition for trial, colonial physicians conducted invasive procedures that served no legal purpose but provided opportunities for systematic degradation. These examinations, conducted without privacy or consent, were designed to strip away the last vestiges of dignity and autonomy that had defined these women's pirate lives. Contemporary medical records, the few that survived deliberate destruction, reveal procedures that were clearly punitive rather than diagnostic, intended to reinforce the women's powerlessness and vulnerability. The trials themselves became theater designed to transform dangerous criminals into cautionary tales about feminine transgression. Unlike male pirates, who were typically tried for specific acts of piracy and murder, captured women faced additional charges related to their violation of gender norms. Colonial prosecutors crafted cases that emphasized the unnatural horror of women engaging in violence, presenting their crimes not just as piracy, but as fundamental violations of divine and natural law. The courtroom became a stage where society could publicly process its anxiety about women who had claimed masculine privileges and power. Trial records reveal the particular cruelty of legal proceedings designed specifically for women. Prosecutors emphasized the defendants' feminine appearance, while simultaneously condemning them for abandoning feminine virtue. The contradiction was intentional, creating a psychological trap where the accused could neither embrace nor reject their gender without confirming their guilt. Women who appeared too feminine faced accusations of using their sexuality to manipulate men into criminality. Those who maintained masculine demeanor were condemned for their unnatural rejection of womanhood. The legal system had created a framework where feminine identity itself became evidence of guilt. The most disturbing aspect of these trials was the systematic presentation of evidence about the women's sexual relationships with crew members. Colonial prosecutors understood that public revelation of these details would destroy any sympathy the defendants might receive, while simultaneously providing vicarious thrills for spectators. Intimate details of shipboard relationships were presented as evidence of moral corruption, transforming private experiences into public humiliation. The courtroom became a theater of sexual degradation where captured women were forced to listen as their most intimate moments were dissected for public entertainment. Sentencing represented the culmination of this gender-specific punishment system. While male pirates typically faced straightforward execution, captured women confronted a range of torments designed specifically to exploit their feminine vulnerabilities. The most common sentence was public whipping, but the implementation differed dramatically from male floggings. Women were stripped to the waist and whipped in market squares, their exposed bodies becoming spectacles of feminine submission and vulnerability. The crowds that gathered for these events were encouraged to view the punishment as restoration of natural order, the violent correction of women who had forgotten their proper place in society. The whipping posts used for women were deliberately designed to maximize humiliation. Unlike the standard posts used for male criminals, those designated for women featured restraints that forced the prisoners into positions that emphasized their feminine attributes, while making resistance impossible. Contemporary accounts describe crowds that included unusual numbers of women, colonial wives and daughters, brought to witness what happened to females who transgressed social boundaries. The message was clear and intentional. This could be the fate of any woman who forgot her proper place in society, but physical punishment was only the beginning of their ordeal. After the public whipping, surviving women faced imprisonment conditions specifically designed to break their psychological resistance. They were housed in special cells beneath colonial fortresses, spaces that had been modified to create maximum psychological pressure. The cells were deliberately cramped, forcing prisoners into positions that emphasized their physical vulnerability while making it impossible to maintain the confident postures that had served them as pirates. Lighting was carefully controlled to create an atmosphere of constant twilight that disoriented prisoners and made it impossible to maintain normal sleep patterns. Food became another weapon in the systematic destruction of these women's identities. Colonial authorities provided deliberately minimal rations, but the presentation was calculated to reinforce feminine helplessness. Prisoners received tiny portions served on delicate china, creating a grotesque parody of genteel feminine dining that mocked their previous lives of rough equality with male pirates. Women who had eaten from the same bowls as their crews and shared the same hardships now found themselves forced to maintain feminine table manners while slowly starving. The psychological torture extended to deliberate manipulation of the prisoner's appearance. Colonial authorities assigned female servants to visit the cells regularly, ostensibly to help maintain the prisoner's feminine presentation, but actually to provide constant reminders of proper womanhood. These servants, carefully chosen for their conventional feminine virtue, would dress the prisoner's hair, apply cosmetics, and maintain their clothing while delivering lectures about the importance of feminine submission and obedience. The contrast between their current helplessness and their former power created a psychological pressure designed to break their resistance completely. Religious instruction formed another layer of this systematic campaign. Colonial clergy visited the imprisoned women regularly, but their sermons focused specifically on feminine sin and the importance of gender hierarchy. These weren't general religious services, but targeted psychological attacks designed to convince the prisoners that their very nature as women made their crimes especially heinous. The message was consistent and unrelenting. Women who claimed masculine privileges violated divine law and deserved whatever punishment they received. The most horrifying aspect of these religious sessions was their focus on sexual confession. Colonial priests pressed the imprisoned women to provide detailed accounts of their intimate relationships with crew members, ostensibly for spiritual cleansing, but actually to gather information that would be used for further humiliation. These confessions, extracted under threats of additional punishment, were then shared with colonial authorities and sometimes read aloud during subsequent court proceedings. The intersection of religious authority and sexual degradation created a particularly effective tool for psychological destruction. Medical treatment in these specialized prisons became another form of torture. Colonial physicians, operating under instructions from prison authorities, provided care that was designed to keep prisoners alive while maximizing their suffering. Treatments for injuries received during capture or punishment were deliberately painful and humiliating, administered in ways that emphasized the women's helplessness and dependence on male authority. Even basic medical procedures became opportunities for degradation, with physicians conducting unnecessary examinations and procedures that served no medical purpose beyond reinforcing the prisoner's powerlessness. The fate of pregnant pirate women represented the most disturbing intersection of gender and punishment in colonial justice. Unlike male pirates who faced immediate execution, pregnant women received temporary reprieve that transformed into extended torture. Colonial law required that pregnant criminals be kept alive until after childbirth, but the implementation of this policy created opportunities for sustained psychological and physical abuse. Pregnant prisoners faced months of specialized torment designed to exploit their maternal vulnerabilities while ensuring the survival of children who would be immediately separated from their mothers upon birth. The conditions for pregnant prisoners were carefully calculated to create maximum psychological pressure. They were housed in cells where they could hear the cries of other infants, children of previous prisoners who had been placed in colonial orphanages. The message was unmistakable. Their own children would suffer the same fate, growing up as wards of the colony with full knowledge of their mother's crimes. This psychological torture proved remarkably effective at breaking the resistance of women who had previously shown no fear of death or physical punishment. Colonial records, the fragments that survived deliberate destruction, reveal systematic policies for dealing with the children of executed pirate women. These infants were placed in specialized orphanages where they received religious education focused on their mother's sins and their own need for redemption. The children were given new names and identities, but were constantly reminded of their criminal heritage as a way of preventing them from taking pride in their mother's rebellious example. In effect, the punishment of pirate women extended to their innocent children, creating a multi-generational campaign of psychological control. The execution of pirate women followed rituals designed specifically to reinforce gender hierarchy. Unlike the relatively quick hangings typical for male pirates, women faced elaborate ceremonies that transformed their deaths into public theater about feminine submission. The condemned women were dressed in white gowns that emphasized their feminine vulnerability while mocking the masculine clothing they had worn as pirates. They were led to execution platforms through crowds that had been deliberately cultivated to include large numbers of women and children, creating an audience that would internalize the lesson about gender transgression. The execution method itself was chosen to maximize the symbolic impact of feminine submission. While male pirates were typically hanged, a relatively quick death that maintained some dignity, captured women faced slower forms of execution that prolonged their suffering and emphasized their helplessness. Some were burned at stakes, their feminine screams serving as audio reinforcement of the message about gender roles. Others faced elaborate hanging procedures that took much longer than necessary, allowing crowds to observe extended death agonies that were presented as natural consequences of feminine rebellion. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these executions was their documented effect on female spectators. Colonial authorities carefully tracked the reactions of women who attended these events, noting with satisfaction that attendance at pirate women's executions was followed by decreased reports of feminine disobedience and increased church attendance among colonial wives and daughters. The public destruction of rebellious women served its intended purpose as a deterrent, creating a climate of fear that kept other women firmly within prescribed gender roles. The systematic erasure of these events from historical records began almost immediately after their occurrence. Colonial governors, understanding that detailed accounts of gender-specific torture might create sympathy for the victims or inspire other women to rebellion, ordered the destruction of most official documents related to captured pirate women. Court records were burned, witness testimonies were suppressed, and surviving participants were sworn to secrecy under threat of criminal charges. This deliberate historical amnesia extended to contemporary newspapers and chronicles. Colonial publishers, operating under pressure from religious and political authorities, avoided detailed coverage of pirate women's trials and executions. When these events were mentioned at all, they were described in vague terms that emphasized the criminals' repentance and submission rather than the specific nature of their punishment. The goal was to erase not just the individuals, but any detailed knowledge of how colonial society dealt with women who challenged gender boundaries. The few records that survive this systematic destruction provide glimpses into a punishment system that was designed specifically to terrorize potential female rebels. Private letters between colonial officials reveal explicit discussions about using captured pirate women as examples to discourage other women from stepping outside prescribed roles. These communications demonstrate that the torture and execution of female pirates was not simply punishment for their crimes, but deliberate psychological warfare against women who might consider claiming masculine privileges. Modern historians attempting to reconstruct these events face enormous challenges due to the successful erasure campaign. Most information comes from private diaries and letters that escaped official attention, fragments of testimony that provide horrifying glimpses into systematic gender-based persecution. The scattered evidence suggests that dozens of women may have suffered these elaborate punishments, their stories deliberately lost to history in order to prevent them from inspiring future feminine rebellion. The psychological impact of this persecution extended far beyond the immediate victims. Colonial women who witnessed or heard about these punishments internalized powerful messages about the consequences of gender transgression. Church records from the period show significant increases in female religious participation and confession following public punishments of pirate women. The terror was deliberate and effective, creating a generation of women who were afraid to challenge any aspect of prescribed gender roles. The legacy of this systematic persecution continues to influence how we understand both piracy and gender in colonial society. By erasing the stories of captured pirate women, colonial authorities successfully eliminated most evidence of women's participation in maritime rebellion. This historical gap has allowed romanticized narratives of piracy to flourish while hiding the brutal reality of how society dealt with women who claimed the same freedoms as men. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that this pattern of gender-specific punishment was not unique to piracy cases. Similar evidence suggests that colonial authorities used comparable methods to deal with women who challenged gender boundaries in other contexts, from religious dissent to economic independence. The captured pirate women were not anomalies, but examples of a systematic approach to controlling feminine rebellion through targeted terror. The few documented cases that provide detailed information reveal the particular psychological sophistication of these punishment systems. Colonial authorities understood that women who had found empowerment in rejecting feminine roles required different forms of control than traditional female criminals. The punishment had to specifically target the sources of their strength, systematically destroying the masculine identity that had allowed them to function as pirates while forcing them back into feminine vulnerability. The international dimensions of this persecution remain largely unexplored due to the successful erasure of records. Evidence suggests that colonial authorities in different regions shared information about effective methods for dealing with captured pirate women, creating a coordinated campaign that extended across multiple jurisdictions. French, Spanish, and British colonies may have developed similar approaches, but the deliberate destruction of records makes it impossible to determine the full scope of this systematic persecution. The medical aspects of gender-specific punishment deserve particular attention for their demonstration of how colonial authorities weaponized healthcare itself. Physicians who participated in these systems violated fundamental medical ethics in service of political control, using their knowledge of feminine anatomy and psychology to create more effective torture methods. The intersection of medical authority and gender-based persecution created opportunities for sustained abuse that would have been impossible without professional medical participation. The religious justifications for gender-specific punishment reveal the deep intersection between colonial Christianity and patriarchal control. Colonial clergy developed elaborate theological arguments for why women who claimed masculine roles deserved special punishment, creating religious frameworks that transformed torture into divine justice. These theological innovations had lasting impact on colonial religious culture, reinforcing gender hierarchies through spiritual authority that was difficult for believers to challenge. The economic dimensions of pirate women's punishment also reflected colonial priorities about gender and labor. Women who had participated in piracy represented a loss of potential domestic labor, and their punishment was designed partly to deter other women from abandoning their economic roles as wives and mothers. Colonial authorities understood that feminine participation in piracy threatened not just political order, but the economic system that depended on women's unpaid domestic labor. The social psychology of crowds that attended these punishments reveals disturbing insights into collective participation in gender-based persecution. Colonial authorities carefully cultivated audiences that would internalize and spread the intended messages about feminine submission. The participation of women and children in these events was not coincidental, but part of a deliberate strategy to normalize gender-based violence through community participation. The aftermath of these punishments continued to affect colonial society long after the immediate victims were dead. Communities that had witnessed the elaborate torture and execution of pirate women showed measurable changes in gender relations, with increased rates of domestic violence and decreased female participation in economic activities outside the home. The terror was designed to be contagious, spreading through colonial society to affect women who had never considered challenging gender boundaries. As we confront these hidden chapters of colonial history, we are forced to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about how society has always dealt with women who transgress prescribed boundaries. The elaborate punishment systems designed specifically for captured pirate women were not aberrations, but logical extensions of patriarchal power structures that viewed feminine rebellion as threats requiring special countermeasures. The systematic erasure of these stories from historical records was itself an act of ongoing persecution, ensuring that future generations would have no knowledge of how women who claimed masculine freedoms had been brutally suppressed. The silence has been so complete that most people remain unaware that pirate women faced punishments specifically designed to exploit their gender vulnerabilities, while male pirates received relatively quick executions. But perhaps most haunting is the question that colonial authorities worked so hard to prevent future generations from asking. If these women pose such a threat to social order that they required elaborate gender-specific torture rather than simple execution, what exactly was the colonial establishment so afraid they might inspire in other women? Were they merely punishing individual criminals, or were they desperately trying to destroy something that terrified them about the possibility of feminine freedom itself?